Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're pretty excited about today's session. We have as our guest Ted Kury, who's our Director of Energy Studies. Ted has been conducting a course for people who are trying to deal with some of the financial fallouts from the pandemic. And we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about some of the lessons that are emerging from that course. So even if you're not part of it, this would be a good part of a good discussion to have. We're making sure that through this, we're not revealing the identities of anyone that he has in the course. So we'll be just talking about some basic ideas, basic principles from some actual cases. So Ted, let's just jump right into it. You've noticed that, as I understand it, that the pandemic has changed kind of day-to-day decision-making for some utilities. Would you describe what that's like, please?
Sure. I think this extends to any crisis, but certainly it's a factor in the present one, is the trade-off between the speed of decision making and the prudency of decision making. And everybody knows that we want to make decisions. In some cases, we have to make decisions quickly. But the regulated utility industry is a little bit different. If Walmart, for example, needs to make a decision quickly, they make a decision, and if the decision doesn't work out well for them, they're really responsible to themselves. They work in a market that is, for the most part, unregulated in the products that they provide, the services they provide, and if the decision goes poorly, they're pretty much responsible to themselves. A regulated utility, though, is different. Regulated utilities, although they may seem like it, are not autonomous entities. Regulatory agencies are not autonomous entities. Governments are not autonomous entities. When they make decisions, there is someone looking at that decision and saying, hey, was it a good idea to do things that way? So it's that trade-off between the speed of decision making and then, are we making a good decision, that I've seen as one of the big challenges through all of this. And it's just because the regulated utility business is different. It's different from, it's different from most every other business out there, in that you've got accountability to a regulator, to a government, that may be missing in other types of markets. So that's been one of the interesting things, where you're looking at this idea of what went into the decision. And that's why a framework becomes so important, a framework for making that decision, so that you're not necessarily looking at the prudency of the decision based on the results, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but looking at that decision in the form of, did it conform to the framework that you've established for making decisions in a crisis? So I think if there's one thing that all of this has highlighted for many people, especially in the regulated utility space, is a greater highlight on that framework for making decisions. Not necessarily what do you decide, but how do you decide it?
Well, that, Ted, raises the very premise of these webinars that we're doing, that nobody knows exactly what the best practice is. We don't know how to make a prudent decision. We just have to have a good system for that. So let me ask, what's your advice to regulators? Because a year from now, 2 years from now, they'll be looking at the decisions, doing prudency assessments. How should they do that well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit early yet in this crisis for us to, because we're still dealing with, in many cases, very severely, dealing with the consequences. And so we haven't reached the point where we're necessarily looking back on decisions quite yet. There may be some instances, but for the most part, we're not. But as an example, one of the crises that we face on a regular basis here in Florida is the impact of severe storms on our infrastructure. And that's the type of decision that we're always looking back on. And what I've observed is, everybody's always kind of in a difficult situation. Basically, the decision that that utilities in Florida and the regulator faces is when a storm is coming, how much preparation do you put into your systems to be ready for the storm? And you face two problems in that situation. One, you might prepare and spend a lot of resources preparing for the storm, and then at the last minute, it veers off and it doesn't actually hit you. So you've expended all those resources preparing, the storm doesn't hit you, and somebody asks, hey, were you really supposed, what about all that money you spent preparing and the storm didn't hit you anyway? The flip side of that is if someone perceives that you didn't prepare enough and the storm hits, the question comes after, hey, why didn't you prepare more for that storm? So, you're caught in a difficult situation where, either way, there's potential at least for your decision to be questioned. But that's where the framework comes in. One of the things that we do, I think quite well here in Florida, is talk about storm preparation. The regulator and the utility have regular conversations about what are we doing to prepare for these severe storms? What are the types of measures that would be cost effective to employ? What are the types of things that maybe we don't need to do? And then in that case, the regulator focuses primarily on, did you adhere to this framework that we've established? I don't think anybody has established a framework for what do you do if we have a global pandemic and everybody's stuck inside for 2 months, and we still need access to all these services, or in the case of telecom, greater access to some of these services. But I still think that the overall principle, looking at the framework in which you made the decision, rather than expecting the utility or the regulator or the government to have somehow seen the future, is a much better approach.
Okay, well, that's going to be a change in how regulators practice. So, okay, good insight. Thank you. So what are we learning about how companies do business? So how is that changing, or what kinds of things are being revealed through the pandemic?
I think some folks are learning more about some of the inner workings of the utilities than maybe they wanted to know. Certainly, some of these details are not foreign to the people who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. But I think that there are more details about a utility's operation being revealed to more folks. Let me give you an example. For a lot of utilities that rely on fuel from outside sources, and that is most utilities. When you have a fuel contract, typically one provision of that fuel contract is how far in advance you have to nominate the fuel that you're going to use in a given week or a given month, whatever it might be. And for some fuel contracts, you may have to nominate fuel 3 months in advance, which means your fuels manager is going in, making a projection of how much fuel you're going to use in 3 months. Fuels manager tells the supplier basically makes a commitment to deliver that much fuel to you. Typically, you have a provision in the contract that you can adjust the amount by maybe plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 20% with less notice. But most utilities are still locking in a portion of their fuel a couple of months in advance. And that's fine for normal operations, but when all of a sudden your industrial demand or commercial demand collapses, and that changes your fuel requirements, that may be a detail that not everybody in the company or not everybody at the regulatory agency was aware of. Everybody just kind of thinks, oh, well, we can get whatever fuel we need whenever we need it. There are contractual provisions that you, in your job, may not have been aware of. Yes, your fuels manager has always known about those things, and they've always taken care of it kind of as part of their day-to-day operation. But I think more of that is becoming transparent to a greater audience. The accessibility of accounts receivable, for example. Who owes you money and how quickly can you get that money, whether it's from a corporate affiliate or other types of folks. How accessible are your accounts receivable? That's something that your CFO has always understood. Your accounts manager has always understood, but now more people are worrying about that type of thing. So I think that there are some often esoteric details about utility operation that we didn't tend to worry about quite so much. I think we're worrying about some of those details a lot more. I think in general, people are learning a lot more about utility service as a result of this crisis.
All right, well, thank you. A lot of utility operations have either subsidiaries or sister companies, and the effects spill over one way or another. So maybe an effect spillovers from the utility to the sister or subsidiary, or vice versa. What are you seeing in that regard?
Again, I think we're seeing a greater understanding of how risk transfers are taking place. Certainly when we're regulating utilities, we're trying to insulate the regulated utility to the extent that we can, insulate them from some of the risk of unregulated businesses or other subsidiaries. I mean, that's an overall goal of regulations. We want to try to make sure that the customers of the regulated utility are really only subject to the risks of the regulated business and insulated as much as we can from outside. And we'll do that through accounting separations. We'll do that through rules of practice. We'll do that through reporting requirements to the regulator. So the regulated utility might have to report on how much of the time of different staff is spent on regulated activity versus non-regulated activity, or if the CEO, for example, splits his or her time between the regulated entity and other subsidiaries. Certainly the regulator wants to know, well, how much of your time is being charged to the regulated part of the business? So we put those types of things in place, but I don't think anybody has completely solved that separation problem. There are always these effects where you're potentially spilling over some of the risk from the unregulated business to the regulated. And I think that during times of crisis, some of that is magnified. There may be effects that you either weren't aware of or unintended effects. A lot of utilities, for example, offer energy management services to their customers. And in some cases, those energy management services are considered unregulated. Since lots of different companies could offer energy management, the regulator allows the utility to offer those services, but doesn't make it a part of the regulated business. Well, when you're in an environment now where you don't have access to people's homes, you don't have access to people's business, maybe the utility's ability to provide those energy management services isn't what it was before. And so you have to ask the folks that are providing those services, what's happened to them? Is the utility continuing to pay them even though they can't provide the unregulated services? Are those folks being cut back, furloughed in some way? Do you have a situation where those folks also provide services for the regulated part of the business? So now effectively, the regulated customers are paying for those employees, all of their time instead of just part of their time. So again, I think that this crisis is illuminating aspects of utility operation and utility regulation that maybe we weren't all that aware of before.
That certainly comes back to some issues that we've seen before. In fact, on your previous discussion about thinking about the cash flow and the managing receivables, I don't know how many of our participants have taken advantage of the webinars that Canto is providing. We partner with Canto for some of our telecom webinars. And they just finished a little bit ago a CEO webinar where the CEO of the telecom company, I think is from Aruba, I may have that wrong, my apologies if I do, was talking about that very issue of how they were managing the accounts receivable to make sure they got enough cash coming in, but also be able to cover investments they need to make in the future. And then you're talking about the risks that go on with the subsidiaries. That gets right back to a lot of supply chain issues that we've been talking about, sometimes unaffiliated, but it's something that the utility always needs to be paying attention to. And now the regulators have to pay more attention to it. So some good thoughts there. Just to remind people, in just about 2 minutes, after Ted answers the next question anyway, we'll start taking questions through the chat. So if you have questions, comments, please put them there. I'll moderate that for about 15 minutes, and then we'll turn things over to you. We'll open up the mics and let you share with each other. So another question then, Ted, are you observing the role of the regulator changing as we're going through this experience?
Yeah, one thing I think that we always struggle with on the regulatory side is the degree of involvement that the regulator has in the manner in which the utility is providing service. I mean, certainly when you're looking at who are the professionals at doing the day-to-day operations, maintaining service, running the power plants, maintaining the system, dealing with customer needs on a regular basis, that expertise pretty clearly lies with the utility. However, every regulatory agency, wherever you are in the world, you've got something in your rules of practice or your business statement or anything else, maybe even the legislation that enabled you. There is some form of ensure the provision of safe, reliable service at just and reasonable rates. So while the technical expertise tends to lie with the utility, there's no getting around the fact that the regulator is still responsible for making sure that that service is being provided and that that service is being provided at just and reasonable rates. So I think what we're doing is, especially when we're reacting quickly and in some cases having to react decisively, you're starting to see at least greater temptation on the part of the regulator to get more involved in, maybe necessarily how the utility is doing something, rather than focusing more on the outputs, because at the end of it, that statement, safe, reliable service, just and reasonable rates, those are outputs. And I think as long as those things are being accomplished, the regulator maybe doesn't have to worry so much about how those things are being accomplished, as long as you're getting safe, reliable service at just and reasonable rates. But I think in times of crisis, there's a lot more temptation to get into some of the how. And either because there's frustration in that things aren't moving quickly enough, or that you're not having the desired outcomes right away. I don't know what it is. I think I've seen examples of all of those things, in different countries. But I still think it's important for it, even as the temptation comes in, I still think it's important for the regulator to be primarily focusing on outcomes, the things that directly affect the customers, and as much as possible, leave the utility to worry about the how, worry about allocating the resources. But I acknowledge that it is a very strong temptation. So while it's easy for me sitting here to say things like that, certainly in different jurisdictions, the circumstances may vary, and maybe we'll get a chance to hear some of those stories today.
Yeah, it's sometimes it's nice to be the scholar watching things happen as opposed to the person that's in the arena, if you will.
That's
Well,
pretty much
you've teed up.
always nicer to be the scholar than the person who has to deal with it.
Yeah, but you bring up something that we've talked about a lot in our courses, and I was just speaking with a regulator from St. Lucia, I think last week, and I don't see him participating with us today, so I won't call up and to talk on him to talk about it. But he suggested that we need to do an entire session on this idea, this illustration, this visual metaphor, perhaps that we use, that we talk about. If you're the regulator, keep your nose in the utilities business, but your fingers out. So you want to be fully informed, you want to be fully aware of what's going on, but you have to keep your fingers out. And he was asking, does that still apply during a pandemic? It's a great topic for a lot of discussion. And I'll just ask the audience, any of you who are regulators, if you would please just leave us a note. If you'd like to be part of that discussion, let us know, because we'll be looking for people who can be part of our panel to talk about that, because there's no easy answer whatsoever. There's another webinar we're going to have on Tuesday of next week, just a week from today, with Marty Linsky, who's just world famous in being a scholar in the leadership area. He's done a lot of work with us and helped us frame the things that Araceli does in leadership. And he is going to be talking about that kind of a very issue of how do you resist the temptation of trying to provide answers when the answers really aren't so clear, because people will push you for a lot of clarity. And if the world really isn't clear, you have to have the courage to say it's just not clear, and keep people in that learning mode, that next practices mode, for an extended period of time. So you've teed up a lot of things there, Ted. Let me go to our chat now and start getting some questions there. We have a question from, if I pronounce your names incorrectly, my apologies for that. Devashish, my apologies for not getting it quite correctly. Ask, could we have some glimpses in the nature of support that government support that regulated utilities can get in such a crisis? So what kind of support can governments give to utilities to help them be successful in these times? What are you seeing, Ted?
Yeah, I think that's always an interesting question. One of the things I always like to stress whenever I'm especially talking about the money aspect of this business, is that over the long run, the people pay for everything. It is really just a question of how. Governments, for example, governments don't have money. They're just certainly they're a governing entity, but they don't do anything to earn money. They get all the money from the people. Regulated utilities, for example, regulated utilities, under cost of service regulation, they have the opportunity to earn the costs of providing service through the rates that they charge the customers. So the customers are paying for the utility service. So I think when you get into the situation of governments providing subsidies of some sort to the utility, it has to start with the awareness that it's still the people's money. They're just paying a little bit different way. So the idea that the government is going to provide support for the utility so that, let's say the utility doesn't have to raise rates, or so the utility can cut rates to customers. There's got to be that recognition that the people are still paying for it. There's no such thing as the government pays. The government gets the money by taxing the people. So it's just a question of, are people paying for the utility service through their utility bill, or are they paying through their taxes, or are they paying over a longer term through a reduction in some other government service, because the government has to take the money from somewhere. So when we get into that, so I think that's the first thing we have to come to the realization to, is that as attractive as the idea might be, and I understand that it's a really attractive idea, there is no such thing as free money, and there never will be. But I think in terms of practical support, we've seen instances where governments are mandating price decreases, for example. And again, someone has to pay for that. So typically through government support. I think a policy that's been, almost universally adopted is some sort of forgiveness for late charges on bills. And most utilities, I think, have implemented no disconnection policies through the crisis. But understanding that there's a cost necessary to implement a policy like that. And so the compensation has to come from somewhere. So I think you've seen a combination. I think you've seen a combination of policies that are designed to lessen the load on the consumer in terms of necessarily paying their bills when it may be very difficult for them to do so, making sure that they don't lose service in an instance where they might get a little bit behind on the bill. But I still think that we have to understand that all of those things, while they're very attractive, that over the longer term, the people still pay.
Okay, well, that's a wise insight. Yeah, sometimes it's really tempting to make it look like we're lowering bills, but in fact, employee stuff to be paid, fuel still has to be paid for. You're exactly right. So, but that's related to it. You started actually down this road. Pasapong, and Pasapong, I hope things are going well for you. Has a question. It says, all right, suppose that the government says that customers should get either free electricity or significantly reduced rates. How does the regulator then help out the operator? Because that can raise some tough times.
It can. And once again, I think we're getting into the space that all you're really doing is changing how people are paying for the service. You're not necessarily changing whether they will pay for the service. So you're shifting that payment around. I know that certainly over the short run, you can have some of that burden falling on the utilities investors. And that's why I specified that over the long run, I think the people pay for everything. So, at some of these instances, you'll get a short run effect that now the return that investors require to provide capital for the utility, that may be impacted. The problem is that investors tend to react to things like that. Investors provide funding for utilities capital assets with some understanding that this is the amount of risk that they're bearing. And so for that amount of risk, this is the return that they're going to require to bear that risk. Well, if the risk profile changes, or if the investor's perception of risk changes because they're not receiving the return that they thought, at least in the short run, what that's going to do over the longer run, it's going to increase their perception of the risk, and that in turn increases the required rate of return. So while we can have in the short run, an instance where we're shifting some of those costs from the people to the investors, who incidentally are people too. I think over the longer run, the investors are going to make sure that they get paid. And the people paying those bills ultimately will be the people you're trying to help in the first place. So I think it has to start with that understanding. And then I think beyond that, it's then, is there something that the regulator can do to mitigate that perception of risk? I think if there are mechanisms that the regulator can put into place through their orders, through their actions, through their precedents, in order to mitigate that perception of risk, I think that is important for the sustainability of the utility over the longer term. I also think that it will save the people money in the long run as well. because now you're what you're making sure is that the capital will still flow in the future, but flow in at a reasonable rate of return. Because one thing we learned is that investors will always provide, there's the common perception that, oh, there's just no capital available. Usually what we mean by that is there's no capital available at a price that I'm willing to pay. But you get to the point where you actually need that capital to grow your system or sustain your system, you'll find somebody to provide it to you. But you might not like the rates that they're going to charge.
So one of the things we've seen in the US, and I don't know that I've seen it elsewhere done this way, but I've seen in the US when the government primarily says, we just don't want prices to increase now. We want them to stay frozen for a period of time. And the utility then is given the right to recover that money plus interest on down the road. As if somebody adopted that as a solution, what are kind of the things that are important to do that well, and what are some of the warnings that you would have for people that might follow that policy?
Yeah, the big problem you run into there is when we start talking about the impact of something on future customers. There are politicians, for example, may have a relatively short decision time frame. They care a lot about what's happening now. Maybe they care a lot about what's happening next year. Because let's face it, a lot of politicians see their job as making sure that they get reelected. And so you're trying to appeal to the folks who are voting now. Customers that may exist 20 years from now, 30 years from now, they may not be the people voting for you today. So sometimes it's easy politically to push costs off onto future customers that may not currently be voters. They may not even be born, but someone's got to be looking out for those future customers. And it may, certainly I've seen utilities that worry about what does this system look like for in 20 years, in 25 years, in 30 years. But certainly I think the regulator needs to be worrying about that. There has to be this idea of, sure, we could put a rate freeze in place today, let the company basically accrue those costs as, in some sort of account. That account grows, effectively becomes a part of the rate base for the utility. And then we allow them to recover that amount, beginning in 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. That may look like a good strategy, but we still have to be worrying that, if the people aren't paying now, but they're going to pay later. And is that trade-off, just and reasonable? Because that's what that's what the regulator has to worry about when we're looking at rates. Does that constitute just and reasonable treatment of our current customers relative to our future customers? And I think that's always something we're going to be struggling with, because in some ways it's a lot easier to put things off until tomorrow, but sometimes it's really, really expensive to do that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Ted. Sam, I think I'll turn things over to you to moderate. I know Alfred still has a question in the chat. Perhaps we can unleash his mic and then he can ask that question verbally, but you're the moderator now, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both very much. So so it looks like we do have a question from Alfred. I'm going to go ahead and unmute. Alfred, can you hear us? His audio doesn't seem to be working.
Okay, well, I can read the question then.
Okay.
And let Ted answer it.
Okay.
So Ted, the question from Alfred is following in the same vein as to what Pasahong was asking about. But he's getting a little bit more ex ante, if you will, before you get into that issue. So it would like for the government to engage with the regulator, have discussions before it requires a price decrease or for free service or what have you. So two things. One is, what can a regulator do to help make sure that happens, that the regulator's engaged and can say, here's the problems you can create? So how do you play that role? And if you don't, then if you're not in that role, then what would you possibly do? So, but I think you've already asked the last question, so maybe just the first one. What can you do to put yourself in that role?
Yeah, that's a challenging trade-off. You know, I mean, one thing that we strive for our regulatory agencies is, you know, this quality that we talk about as independence. You look at anything that, you know, say the World Bank or the IMF publishes, and they're always talking about the importance of independent regulatory agencies. But as we all know, there's no such thing as a truly independent regulator, because all regulatory agencies are ultimately creatures of statute. So the government created the agency. And the consequence of that is that if the government wants to, as certainly we've learned here in the United States, since the government has created your agency, the government can also dissolve your agency if things get bad enough. So much like the regulator's challenge in being independent of the utility, but still having to work with them on some of these challenging issues, you have the same thing on the government side. You know, you have to be, you have this degree of independence and transparency, but there's still an integral part of that relationship. And I think if there's one thing that we learn about any big problem in this business, is that it is nearly impossible for the government, for the utility, for the regulator to address these problems unilaterally. It takes some sort of effort on the part of all three. So I don't know if this involves regular scheduled communication. I don't know if this is maybe just having a process in place where you are communicating information to the government and the government is communicating information to the regulator in a timely manner, whether you've established channels for that communication, if there's a designated contact person. I don't know, you know, the individual circumstances that might exist in different countries, but I still think having established a framework for communication and processes for what to do in a crisis in general. As I said, certainly nobody saw something like this happening, but you know, to the extent that you have that framework in place, and I think if there's one thing that we're going to see coming out of all of this is maybe a bit more attention paid to the framework that we have in place to deal with some of these unexpected occurrences.
Okay. All right, thank you, Ted. Sam, do we have someone with their hand up?
So we don't have anyone with their hand up yet, and I kind of just wanted to go over that. Unfortunately, we were trying to unmute Alfred. But if you would like to raise your hand, if you're using a desktop or a laptop, please go to the bottom Zoom toolbar and you'd select participants, and it gives you the option to select the hand icon. And if you are using a cell phone or a tablet, that toolbar is at the top. And then also, if you're having trouble with that, please just feel free to send me a comment and I'll be happy to unmute you. It does look like we do have a question here from Brian. So Brian, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute your audio.
That's still showing muted on my screen, Sam.
Yeah, mine as well.
I am muted.
Brian, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I am muted. I am muted.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, so Ted.
Hey, Brian.
How are you doing?
Good.
Here's the question. Should a utility company use some part of its funds that would normally have gone to shareholders in the form of dividends to support lower bills to its customers as a coping mechanism, given that some customers would have lost their jobs and are struggling to pay the bills? And if so, should the utility company be able to recover their associated costs from a rate review application?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, when we're getting into some of the day-to-day cash management, as Mark alluded, or Mark asked me a question before of what are some of the things that we're learning about utility operations through this crisis. I think one of the things, as brought up by your question, which I appreciate, is basically who do we owe money to and when? And can we shift the timing at all of some of that money to use it for other purposes? So you brought up the question of money to shareholders, and I'll address that in just a second. But other examples that I can think of is the utility having obligation. Maybe the utility collects taxes on behalf of the government, so they pay the government these taxes. Or they might collect fees, regulatory assessment fees for the money that goes to fund the regulator. And that money might be paid out to the regulator or to the government, let's say on a quarterly basis or at the end of the fiscal year, whatever it might be. And so, the company might be able to use some of that cash in the meantime, even though it represents an obligation to the government or to the regulator. They may be able to utilize some of that cash for day-to-day operations to fund, temporary ratepayer relief measures, whatever they happen to be. Now, the tricky part with money to shareholders is that unlike money to a lender or to the government or to the regulator, money to shareholders doesn't really represent an obligation. Dividends are paid to shareholders. The understanding with a shareholder is that dividends will be paid, once everything else is left over. And so there really isn't the same obligation with equity holders as there is for maybe other folks. So certainly, as far as the question, can they use money that would normally go to shareholders to fund some of these ratepayer measures? The answer is absolutely they can. The question then becomes, what are the consequences of doing that? As I mentioned, one of the potential consequences is if the shareholders now see that they reassess the risk of investing in that company. Now that pushes their required return to provide capital, it pushes it higher in the future. So that has the potential for causing upward pressure on rates going forward. Whether they can apply to the regulatory commission, that's going to depend quite a bit on individual laws. But it's important to keep in mind that a rate of return under cost of service regulation, a rate of return is not guaranteed. So if the regulator makes a decision that the company is entitled the opportunity to earn 10% on equity, that doesn't mean that 10% is necessarily guaranteed. It means that some years it might be higher, some years it might be lower, but over the long term, it averages out to about 10%. So while your individual laws might differ, I don't see where a payment to a shareholder necessarily fits this idea of, this is a necessary cost to provide service. But I think there will be potential consequences in that if shareholders perceive then a greater risk going forward, then that's going to lead to a greater required rate of return, and as a consequence, increased prices for service. So it's one of those temporal trade-offs that we've been talking about, I think.
Yeah, so that gets complicated because when we think about the amount of revenue the operators to receive, we base that upon essentially the rate base and the operating expenses, taxes, the rate of return, things like that. Dividends to shareholders aren't part of that formula, but they feature prominently in the cash flow. And so that becomes an issue, as I understand what you're saying, of if the operator needs to finance the accounts receivable that aren't being paid right now, what's the best way to do that? Is it through, I'm not going to pay dividends so much? Does it take it out of the current cash reserves it might have? If it has those, there are just those different options it has to work through, all of which have consequences down the road. So the regulator needs to keep the nose in and see exactly what is going on. All right, Sam, we have another question in the chat.
We do, yes. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so it looks like we have a question from, and please forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Debayasish. Can you hear us?
Yep. Yes,
Okay,
I can.
great. Thank you so much.
You got my name more or less right.
Oh, well, good. Well,
She
thank
did
you.
better than I did, yeah.
So yeah, so if you'd like, you can go ahead and speak freely with Ted now. So your audio's out and,
Okay.
and Ted can hear you.
Okay. Hello, Ted. First of all, thanks a lot for this wonderful, informative webinar. My question was, where do you draw the line between the between the regulator implementing government policies and guidelines and the regulator becoming like a second source of guidelines and policies? And where do you draw the line? Because that's something which I've been hearing, from what I understand, a regulator's role is to actually make sure the implementation of government policies, and it's the government's remit to formulate the policies and guidelines. Or where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's especially relevant when we are dealing with a crisis and talking about, as I opened with, this trade-off in decision-making between expediency and prudency. I think we have to still recognize that ultimately the regulator is a creature of statute. And the only reason and all the powers of the regulatory agency come from that statute or subsequent acts. So basically, the regulator has all of the authority that the law allows. So when you get into broader policy issues, I think sometimes the statute provides a framework, and then the regulator kind of fills in the details. So getting back to my original or one of the things I had talked about, in every statute enabling a regulator, there's some form of safe, reliable service, just and reasonable rates. But very rarely does the statute actually define what is safe, what is reliable, what is just, what is reasonable. And they leave the regulator to make those decisions. So I think that from a policy standpoint, the statute might be very broad in that we want to promote renewable generation or distributed generation or something of that nature. And then the regulator is left to fill in the details. But I don't think you're going to have any instance where the regulator is going to make a policy that the government doesn't necessarily agree with, because the power of the government is still always sitting over that regulatory agency. Now, the government may ask the regulator, because the regulator is typically the subject matter experts on what does it take to improve renewable generation or extend the electricity grid into this new area. So the regulator may have a role in what that legislation looks like, but when it comes to defining broad policies, I think that overarching power of the government is always going to win out over anything that the regulator does. I mean, ultimately, the regulator has the powers that the government set out for them. No more, no less.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
So it doesn't look like we have any hands raised just yet. or any questions that have populated in the chat. But just a reminder to you all, if you're having trouble raising your hand in the participant box at the bottom of the screen, please feel free to submit any questions or comments directly to the chat, and I'll be happy to address those.
Okay, well, I have one more question for you, Ted. So what are we learning now about how we should prepare or do prepare for the next crisis that's going to come, and we'll be surprised by it as well? But how do we prepare?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is this has forced us to rethink what is possible. A year ago, I don't think there was anybody that was thinking about, hey, what if we have some sort of global pandemic that shuts everybody in for 3 months? I mean, you see, I've seen lots of planning documents for utilities, for regulatory agencies, and I have to say, I've never seen that one analyzed. So I think the first thing this is going to do is redefine for us how bad things can get. But oddly enough, I think that makes for a stronger system going forward. So we're probably gonna end up expending a lot of resources to deal with this particular issue, and some of those resources are being expended because there was just simply things that we didn't plan on. But I think by expanding this idea of what we think is possible, I think that's going to help us to let's have other plans in place. I think this has helped us to redefine what we think we are capable of. I think it's helping us to define, where we can be productive, how we can be productive, and I think that only makes us stronger going forward. But what I really expect to see in the immediate future coming out of this is a much more robust framework for dealing with crises. I know that in the case of storm hardening, for example, I talked a little bit before about the framework that Florida has in place for planning for storm events. And I know from talking with folks in the US and in other countries that not everybody has a framework like that in place for dealing with severe storms. And I don't think anybody had a framework in place for dealing with global pandemic that shuts everybody in for 2.5 months. But I think coming out of this, we're going to have more clearly defined frameworks for dealing with crises, for dealing with events that cause large groups of customers to basically go offline for a period of time, for us to shift the way that we use electricity services and gas services and telecommunications services. I think we're learning a lot about the capacity of our system to deal with things that go wrong. And I think we're redefining some of the needs that we place on the system, some of the ways we think about what is safe and reliable service. And while it certainly doesn't seem like it now, I think that our systems will emerge stronger for it going forward.
All right, well, thank you, Ted. It's interesting, listening to your response. It reminds me of research I've read over the years, some very recently, because I was doing some work on how different industries will perform during the pandemic. And the things that tend to help companies succeed, for one, have your financial house in order already, so that you've got a strong balance sheet, good cash statement, good cash reserves, etc., just like you should always have. The independence of the regulatory agency tends to matter a great deal. That really stood out during the Asian financial crisis of about 15 or so years ago now, maybe 20 years ago. Then there's also coming through the 2008 financial crisis, and probably showing up now as well, but that's some research that we're getting into, being connected well with your community and with other organizations tends to help companies thrive better through this. So those are some really good thoughts. Appreciate your sharing those. So Sam, I'm going to turn things over to you. My gratitude to everyone who's participated today, and especially to Ted for sharing with us some of the things that have been emerging from the class he's teaching on how do you help you analyze the finances of getting through this pandemic.